So welcome. My name is Marc-André. I am the director of the Canadian Centre for the Study of Co-operatives, and it's my great pleasure to introduce our speaker today, Bob Fink. Bob is currently the Chief Corporate Affairs Officer, at the United Farmers of Alberta, or UFA, as it's better known these days. And he's also a member of the Canadian Centre for Study of Co-operatives Research Advisory Council, and has been for a number of years. And we always appreciate his wise counsel. Bob is by profession a lawyer with over 20 years of legal experience in private practice, as well as with large corporations, including, of course, UFA. That experience includes serving as vice president, general counsel, corporate secretary, and human resources. That's all one title at Parkland Fuel Corporation, and general counsel and corporate secretary of Fortis, Alberta. So he brings a lot of real world experience to the cooperative sector in that governance space. Now, some of you may already know these things about Bob. It's on his bio. You can kind of see it if you Google around. What you may not know is Bob is also an exceptional curler. A number of years ago, Bob skipped the team that won the City of Calgary Playdowns. It's a big deal. It's a big deal. Calgary's a big curling powerhouse, and to win the City Playdowns is no trivial matter. As someone who spent a lot of time on the ice, I'm jealous, and I can only hope one day I can encourage Bob to join me as an unofficial ringer on a team at some sort of bonspiel. So today's talk is not about curling, although it could dangerously veer into that space given the people on the call. It's about actually UFA's 10-year comprehensive governance review. Now, I won't say a lot about that because that's what Bob's talk is about. But I just want to flag something that I think is really cool about this, which is that this is a good practice. This is a really great idea for any organization, but I think especially cooperatives to kind of have these periodic top to bottom rethinks. I think the best policies have that built in. They call it sunset clauses, where forces people to think: Are we, do these rules, these ways of doing, still make sense given how things evolved? And as we discuss a lot in our cooperative governance training, a lot of the research that we do, it's kind of natural to expect that cooperatives, a lot of the kind of foundational pieces of cooperatives will change. Members get older, you get new members, you get members who are buying more than other members. You have members from some regions that are, far away, close, rural, urban, all these things, and they change over time. All these kind of factors change over time, and because they do, they have bearing on governance. Now, before I turn things over to Bob, I want to suggest there's kind of an interesting link between what UFA is doing with respect to its governance practices, this 10-year review, and in how we think about reconciliation with the kind of original peoples of this land. So in my case, coming to you from Saskatoon, I'm thinking of the Treaty 6 territory peoples, the Cree, the Saulteaux, Dene, Dakota, Lakota, Nakota, and of course, this is the traditional homeland of the Métis. And the link is this, between that kind of notion of reconciliation and governance review. So acknowledging our shared space, this shared space that we have with these traditional peoples is, I think, implicitly acknowledging or thinking about how we govern these spaces. And when we think of governance, we think of our shared mission, to share in the land's bounty, to share, right, to distribute, to create rules around that, to reflect on its beauty, to share in a mission around these things, to reaffirm our commitment to work together in cooperation and reconciliation. So a little bit about the process. One last little bit before we turn things over to Bob. Bob's going to speak for about 20 minutes, and then we're going to have a short conversation. And I'm going to just judge if we do a breakout or not at that point. We may not this time. I think this is such a meaty topic that we may leave it open, but we'll see. So for now, we're going to just kind of proceed. If you're experiencing any technical difficulties anywhere along the way, you can message Stan. Stan will wave to folks, either virtually or visually. There he is.
Everyone.
And he'll be able to help you. And we are recording this session, and the link will be shared with everyone who registered for this event. So a lot of people register and can't make it, so we make sure that they get the copy afterwards. So that's it for me. Bob, the floor is yours. Looking forward to the talk.
All right. Thanks, Marc-André, and thanks for the introduction. And I will clarify that I am not a competitive curler by any stretch. That's for those guys who can dedicate much more time to the sport than I can, and it's truly amazing what they can do on the ice. But anyway, I appreciate the introduction. So I'm here to talk today about our democratic structure review process. And it occurs every 10 years where UFA looks at its governance structure and practices and makes changes in order to support the go-forward strategy of UFA and best serve our membership. I'll say at the outset, I am constrained by confidentiality in discussing any of the details about what UFA is reviewing and any changes that we might be considering. However, I'm here to talk about the process itself and some of the high-level issues that we may be discussing or looking at. I think of it as having almost a whiteboard for governance practices. You have the opportunity to redo things that may not be working as well, or it's a chance to improve upon certain practices. But then you layer on the complexity of change as well as the cooperative structure itself, and then having to get a larger group of people to agree with those changes. It's a challenge, and it's ultimately the fascination with such a review. You can have the best ideas in the world for improvements to governance, but if you can't get the decision-making body on side with them, those ideas won't move forward. Personally, as a self-proclaimed governance geek, I do really enjoy this process, you can tell. And I'll give a shout out to our elected officials at UFA. They really care about UFA, and they're really quite good as a decision-making body. In my time, I haven't really seen them get anything really wrong in my view, and that's the power of the cooperative. With so many minds addressing an issue, you're bound to come to the right answer more often than not. Stan, can you post my presentation? So if you wouldn't mind just going one slide ahead. And I'll talk a little bit first about who we are and some of the background to the governance, because I think that's important. So we're an agricultural cooperative serving the Western Canadian Agricultural Basin. We were founded in 1909. We are self-governed by our own act and our bylaws. So we're a bit unique in having our own act rather than being incorporated under the Cooperatives Act or Corporations Act. The UFA Act, it provides a few high-level rules for UFA, but most of our rules for our governance come from our bylaws, which these bylaws, they can be amended with the approval of our assembly, who's made up of our elected officials. And I'll explain why this is important for our democratic structure review a little bit later. So we have 120,000 members approximately. Anyone can shop at UFA regardless of whether they're a member or not. For membership, any individual can be a member, so you don't have to be involved in agriculture to be a member of UFA if you're an individual, or a co-op for that matter. So any co-op can be a member as well. And for businesses like corporations and partnerships, they have to be farmer rancher businesses or substantially serving the farming ranching activities in order for them to be a member. So we serve farmers and ranchers, but also general consumers and commercial customers in Alberta, BC, Saskatchewan, Manitoba. You just move ahead, Stan. Oh. So, as you can see on the map, we're spread out over northeastern BC, throughout Alberta, and we're developing a stronger presence in Saskatchewan. We have 34 farm and ranch supply stores, 6 fertilizer blending facilities, 117 petroleum agencies, and we're serving 114 communities. So you can see the breadth of our network on that map. Next slide, Stan. So I mentioned earlier that we have 120,000 members. Only 50,000 of them are eligible to vote or voting members. In order to be a voting member, you have to spend $2,500 in the prior year, or you have to hold equity of $2,000. Essentially, the member has spent with us materially enough in the past to have earned enough patronage that they've got that amount of equity. So it's really about patronizing UFA. Those 50,000 voting members then elect 44 delegates in districts spread out across Western Canada. And those 44 delegates elect 12 board members. In order to be eligible to be a director, they have to spend at least $10,000 in the prior year or hold equity of $5,000, or they have a minimum of $20,000 in member loans with us. So essentially they've got, a lot of skin in the game in order to be a director with UFA. Next slide, Stan. So I just wanted to post a map of our existing districts for our delegates. This is something that we are discussing at the DSR committee. As we move into Saskatchewan and with the normal ebb and flow of our membership and business, there's a need to consider equitable rebalancing of our districts. Some districts may end up with more or less members, voting members, locations, size of geography, and what made sense 10 years ago for the districts may not make sense now. So it makes sense to look at it. And I do have to be cautious here, just to be clear. I'm not saying we're going to change anything. We do have a good group of delegates in place, so we never want to change that for the sake of change. But after 10 years, it is something you do have to look at carefully and then adapt if it makes sense. Ultimately, we have to do what's best to ensure appropriate representation for our membership. Next slide, Stan. So as I mentioned earlier, every 10 years, UFA conducts a democratic structure review process where we assess our governance structure and practices, and we make changes in order to support the go-forward strategy of UFA and best serve our membership. Our goals, they're to assess the current governance practices, examine trends in governance, and take lessons and learn from the successes and the failures of other cooperatives. We then try to identify improvements and enhancements to UFA's governance structure and practices, and we're trying to align our governance practices with our strategic goals and our member needs. Next slide, Stan. Our elected officials, so these are our delegates and our directors, they play a critical role in shaping our governance framework. Our democratic structure review process, it seeks their input, and ultimately they're paramount, and they play a pivotal role because any changes that our democratic structure review committee wants to make, and I'll talk a little bit more about the committee shortly, any changes that the committee wants to make, particularly to our bylaws, have to be ratified by the assembly of elected officials. So our assembly is there to evaluate and consider any recommended changes coming forward from the DSR committee, and making sure that they those changes support UFA's overall governance, strategic plan, and operations. It's then their job to either ratify the recommended changes or reject them if they don't agree with them. And as a matter of approach, we're most likely to separate recommended changes into logical groupings so that, if some changes aren't acceptable and they're rejected by the assembly, then, our assembly doesn't have to reject all of the proposed changes. So it doesn't become an all or nothing thing. Our assembly can consider the merits of sort of the logical groupings of changes and then vote on each of them. Next slide. So I mentioned this earlier, but our democratic structure review, or DSR committee, was formed with the mandate to review UFA's governance practices and present communication or recommendations for change. The final recommendations have to be presented to the assembly for ratification at our 2026 annual general meeting, or we can bring them sooner at the discretion of the committee. If we deem it appropriate, we may bring some of these changes for consideration earlier, just to alleviate all of the pressure on the AGM in 2026. So our DSR committee consists of 4 members of our board of directors, 4 delegates, and 2 employees. Being myself, the Chief Corporate Affairs Officer, and our Director of Special Projects. And employees have been a part of the DSR committee in the past, but not always. So, and I know I speak for both of us employees that we're very honored to have been chosen to be a part of the democratic structure review process. Next slide, Stan. So our timeline, and I've alluded to this already, but We kicked off in June of 2024, and we held 6 meetings to date, involving some initial scoping of changes that we wanted to explore. We've heard from 9 presenters to date who have provided insights on governance. We've actually started drafting some of our first recommendations, and we may or may not bring this forward early for consideration. We're about halfway through our in-scope list for discussion and evaluation. And for 2025, we have 7 more meetings scheduled to complete the review of the in-scope list and to finalize and then socialize any recommendations that we might want to bring forward to the AGM in March of 2026, or like I said, sooner if we're ready to do that. So it's a pretty extensive process. Next slide, Stan. So our approach from the outset has been to gather as much information as we possibly can about governance in general and governance at other cooperatives. And I have to say the cooperative sector is absolutely amazing. I've really come to appreciate how much co-ops are willing to help out other co-ops. As Marc-André said earlier, I've worked in the public sector and now the cooperative sector with UFA, and it's truly special how co-ops are willing to help each other and assist each other. You just reach out and they're there. It's truly amazing. So, in gathering information, we independently studied other cooperative governance structures, trends and learnings from cooperative successes and from failures. We had other co-ops, and including a number of international ones, present and discuss the strengths and weaknesses of their governance structures, including going into detail on their delegate member structures, their board composition, as well as their onboarding and training. We also accessed reports and data from the Centre's Canadian Cooperative Governance Survey dashboard. And what a wealth of information you've assembled there. For your listeners today, if you ever have a question about other cooperatives, the database is truly the place to start. I guess I'm starting to sound like a little bit of a commercial for the Centre, but from board size to average tenure to compensation, that database has just a ton of information in it. We also obtained insights from leaders of other cooperatives, as well as legal and cooperative experts, and even some UFA employees and past board members were canvassed for information. And I do have to say thanks to everybody who has participated and presented to us. It's been extremely valuable. I'll also say that it's almost been information overload for our DSR committee, for the last 6 to 8 months, but we've started distilling that information down, and we've been debating potential changes to our structure based on all that information we've gathered. Many ideas won't make the final recommendations, but I have to say personally, it's been a lot of fun. And again, for the governance geek to be able to test ideas and debate with our committee. Everybody has different mindsets and perspectives around that table. So there have been some great discussions. And I can say that, any recommendations for change that do come out of this process will be very well thought out from the standpoint of what's best for UFA and for our membership. Next slide, Stan. So as I mentioned earlier, our committee's work is confidential, so I can't get into detail around, the recommendations that we might be looking at, but I can speak generally about, thoughts and considerations in any of these areas. And I can also share that, our committee identified key governance areas for us to focus on, such as, our board of directors composition and structure. So for example, what's an appropriate board size? What about tenure and age limits? What about eligibility to serve as a director? And should directors be elected, or, can some be appointed? On the last one, I found that topic to be very fascinating, and for many cooperatives, actually. Co-ops generally draw on their director pool from their membership, so it can sometimes be difficult to find and elect people with particular skill sets. Many cooperatives that we talked to identified this as an issue. Some handled it by searching for those skill sets through their membership base. Others have opened up their membership base. Others are trying to manage it through professional recruitment. Others have appointed positions in order to secure those skill sets for their boards. We even talked to a cooperative that appoints experts to their committees, such as having an external HR professional work as part of their HR committee, even though they're not formally a director. Now, obviously, there's pros and cons to each approach, but the commonality was the issue of finding and getting the desired skill set for the board, which is not always possible if a cooperative is limited to searching from within its membership. On the other side of the coin, what was evidence from studying some of the failures of cooperatives is that many of the failures related to losing sight of what the membership wants. So there's a balancing act or membership representation and skill sets that may be needed, but may not be as focused on the membership. So it was very interesting to see how other cooperatives are dealing with the board structure type issues and getting the skill sets on the board. We also looked at member representation and delegate structures, including the number of delegates that other cooperatives had, as well as whether it was focused on geographical representation, and that's for both directors and delegates. Over time in our own system, inequity is built up in our current structure. We hear about that from some of our delegates. There are imbalances in member representation or in the number of sites in a district that delegates have to visit, or even the size of the district. When you're spread out as much as we are, it can be quite challenging for some districts which are really large compared to something that's a little smaller. So it's another area that we've definitely been looking at and focusing on. Sort of going forward, we're going to be focusing on our board committees as well, such as their structure, tenure terms, as well as the onboarding and training of our elected officials. So there's still lots of work that we have to do. Next slide, Stan. So as we distill down all this information into recommendations to put forward for change, we're going to be informed by the insights that we've gleaned from the other cooperatives and experts. Paramount is ensuring that any proposed enhancements reflect the collective interest of our members and support UFA strategic goals. And finally, any change has to balance the needs of the co-op and our membership. Next slide, Stan. So I'll finish up by talking about some of the lessons and challenges we see in the DSR process. So balancing different perspectives is critical. Getting input from management, board members, and our delegates provides our committee with a diversity in both priorities and viewpoints. This is really a strength of the cooperative model, working together for the betterment of the cooperative and the membership. I believe the studies show that boards with diversity in viewpoints tend to make better decisions. So having a group with differences is great, but it does present the challenge of trying to bring all those differences together for the common good. And obviously that can be a challenge at times. When I talk about bringing together a group with different perspectives, that would include bridging, those who favor more traditional governance approaches with those who favor more forward-thinking strategies. Similarly, it also involves incorporating insights with long-tenured directors and delegates while embracing contributions from some of our newer members with fresher perspectives. The personal impact of any of our recommended changes to our governance practices is something that is top of mind for our committee. While we do believe our assembly would vote for anything if they believed it to be in the best interests of UFA, we know we can't lose sight of the personal impacts, which could include, eligibility for someone to be a director or a delegate. So a dedicated or passionate person's involvement in our cooperative, it could be ended if our recommended changes go forward, and that can be hard to accept. So we really have to be mindful about the personal impact and do our best to mitigate against these impacts, such as considering the grandfathering in of some of these changes. A final thought is doing our best to ensure our governance structure evolves to serve both current and future generations. And I've said this from the outset of the process. We have to be talking about doing what is right for UFA in the long term, in support of our strategy, and what's best for UFA and for the next generation beyond all of our times with UFA. Next slide, Stan. And I'll turn it back to you, Marc-André.
Yeah, thanks. So, Bob, that was great. Stan, can you pull that back up for a sec, please? Just the last slide. Yeah, so I think we're gonna stay plenary. I think probably people have a lot of questions for Bob, but Bob, we always ask people to kind of put a question out to the audience that they'd like answered. And so Bob came up with this. If you're at a cooperative, what changes to your cooperative governance practices would you like to see? If you're not at a cooperative, or just in general, if you are, it doesn't matter. What do you think a cooperative operating in 2025 should be doing that it may not have done in the past? So if you're going to put your hand up, if you have a thought on that, please share it. But also feel free to ask Bob questions. And Bob, Stan has just posted those in the chat, so you can take it down now, Stan. Thank you. So Bob, just to kick things off, I had a couple of quick questions. So this is a process that happens every 10 years. Can you describe how has it played out in the past? So I know you can't talk about too much what's happening forward looking, but in the past, has it led to big changes, or has it been pretty steady Eddie, or what? How would you describe the kind of historical experience?
Yeah, well, so I haven't been involved in past DSR committees, so I can only pass on what, sort of I've heard through the grapevine or passed down through generations. From time to time, it does involve, more major changes to the cooperative. I know they've changed the membership test over time. Delegate districts have been looked at, throughout, I guess, our history. Right. The spend thresholds have changed and evolved over time, and there's some stories about some adverse reactions to some of the recommendations that went forward. I have heard stories of how some changes were just basically completely rejected by the assembly, and it was sort of back to the drawing board, and UFA had to adjust, I guess, the recommendations to something that would be more acceptable to the assembly. So, with a 116-year history, you're gonna have a lot of situations, both good and bad, throughout your history. So
excellent. Thanks, Bob. Okay, we have a bunch of questions in the chat. So I'm going to go to Milton. Milton Friesen asks, your comments on the structure, composition, and size of boards in terms of performance reminded me of the work of Myrta Galeksic has done making on the dynamics of group decision making. I heard her speak. Oh, it's just a link. Okay, it's not a question. Sorry. you can check it out. We'll save the chat for you, Bob, and we can pass that along. Dion has
I'd like to read that.
Yeah, if you have a comment, feel free to jump in. I don't know if you know who Myrta. No, okay.
I don't, but okay. I'm curious now. So
okay. And Milton has followed up, so I'm going to jump to him, and then Dion has a question. So Milton's question is the extent to which board representation dynamics of cooperatives are different than in charities or for-profit boards. What is unique? What is common? Okay, so you're well placed to answer that question because you've been around. Yeah, what do you think, Bob?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I have to gather my thoughts on this one. Like when I think about the board of UFA, at least, and I think it's applicable for other cooperatives. I think the dynamics here would be that our positions are elected for the most part. Well, they are all elected for our directors. Some of our delegates get acclaimed from time to time, but our board is definitely elected. So there's a much more onerous process around the election of our board of directors than, say, for what I've seen in the charity world, the not-for-profit boards. First off, I also think that for-profit boards, they tend to utilize the expertise of networks and recruitment, which we do at the cooperative level. But the election, generally the shareholders in a public company will elect what the board of directors put forward as a slate, unless there's something really wrong. So it's rare that the board in a for-profit situation, the board candidates wouldn't be elected unless there's an activist shareholder or something going on within the I guess the environment of the corporation, the public corporation. In the cooperative, it really is about the skill sets that a person brings, as well as the qualities that a person brings. It's not only about the skill set. They have to fit in. They have to ultimately get themselves elected. And I will say too that I've been impressed with our assembly in making decisions around the elections. I mean, you can in cooperatives get into a political environment where the person that gets elected is the most popular. But here it's not always the case. I think there's a mixture of both popularity as well as skill set. And I have to say I have not really disagreed with any of the decisions made by our assembly. So that's again the power of a cooperative in making good decisions.
Thanks, Bob. I'm going to go to a question from Dion. Dion asks, what have you found to be the most sensitive areas of discussion around governance when considering change?
Ooh.
And that's a sensitive question.
That's a very sensitive question. Well, I did talk about it a bit in our presentation or my presentation today, but any changes that impact people are always the most sensitive. So I think about districts. At one point in time, I talked a little bit about this earlier, but UFA reduced the number of delegates reduced the number of districts, which reduced the number of delegates, and that was quite controversial and very challenging because there was a lot of good people that were very interested in serving the cooperative that no longer had positions to do so, right? So any sort of those people impacts, and like we've looked at other cooperatives and we've heard from them around director tenure, right, or age limits. Those can be very sensitive as well because it means a certain subset of the population may not be eligible after a period of time, right, or after a certain age. So it's definitely the people issues that are definitely the most sensitive.
Great. Okay, so Kurt has a question here. Thanks, Bob. How do you balance the need for expertise with democratic control of the cooperative? There's a lot of, and he goes on to say, there's a lot of pressure to favor expertise. And have you experienced this? Have you felt that pressure?
Absolutely. And I'll say that other cooperatives, as we've reached out to a number of them, grapple with this very issue, right? Like I said in my presentation today, the membership doesn't always have, all the skill sets you might want around the board table. It comes from your membership, and that in of itself is powerful because, your board members do reflect your membership, but, in some cases, they don't necessarily have all the skill sets you might want around the board table. And, there is definitely, pressure to get that expertise on the board. But at the same time, if you add somebody with expertise, you're subtracting somebody that's representing the membership. So, there's definitely pressure to favor expertise. I will say that at UFA, there's definitely pressure to make sure that the membership is represented, and our delegates and our board, clearly let us know that, and in a positive way, right? Because it is ultimately, a co-op is all about the membership. So it's trying to achieve that balance. There is always sort of pressure to get some expertise on there, but I think the important thing is the healthy conversation, the healthy debate, and then ultimately getting to a decision that's right for the cooperative, to ultimately get the right skill sets in place collectively that you can guide your cooperative, because the board of directors is the most important position at the cooperative. It's overseeing all the strategy and the direction of the organization. And if the one thing I will say too, in defense of the membership over expertise, is if you get too professional at the board level, sometimes those cooperatives tend to fail because they lose sight of the membership. So I think there's a number of case studies that we've talked about between the two of us, Marc-André, that illustrate that, right? So, so yes, there's pressure to favor expertise. I'd say there's also pressure that favors the membership, and you got to achieve that balance you need for your cooperative.
Thanks, Bob. I just want to do another little plug for our governance dashboard, because the information in that dashboard comes from a survey, which we're going out with our third wave in March. And by the way, Bob was instrumental in getting that whole process off the ground. So I want to thank Bob and UFA for that support. And one of the questions we ask is around, how many do you have on non-elected board members? And we've noticed a little creeping up of that in the last, over the last two surveys, but we don't have a lot of data going a long period of time yet. But I think this is something that we might start seeing in the data a little more going forward. Okay, so there's a couple of questions here. We have someone from Latvia, which is great. Bob, they might want to follow up with you separately, but their question is, and I'm going to just jump to the question part of this. My question, as a complete beginner in governance, is the following: is the formation of governance the task of the board members, or should it be promoted from the CEO? I'm just reading verbatim. So I guess they're kind of, it's a really kind of foundational question. Who leads that process, I guess, is how from your perspective?
It's always a tricky one to answer because there is a collaboration there that has to occur. I would say, a lot of the work comes from management. But ultimately the board has final say, and it's their job to provide the oversight and provide that direction. So, you're balancing between, I guess, the two, right? And I always worry about, one person having, too much control, almost that dictatorship type scenario, versus, having the collective, particularly in a cooperative situation. I think there's the more minds you've got something on a problem or an issue, I think the better, right? So I think there's a healthy collaboration between the two, and I wouldn't say that one trumps the other, although ultimately the board has the final say.
It's interesting, if I may offer an observation. UFA is a pretty big cooperative, and you'd expect a little more of a division between the board, not division like in terms of antagonistic, but there's separate functions, right? And in a smaller cooperative, you'll typically see the board actually play operational roles, right? Because they can't afford to hire an HR person or a corporate secretary or a lawyer, so and one of the chair might be the CEO in a small, right? So it's just I think it's important to contextualize what Bob's saying is, from the perspective of a larger cooperative, this is a bit of a murkier answer. So put it that way.
That's right. Yeah, operational boards, that's a whole different ballgame.
That's a whole different thing. Yeah. A lot of the co-ops that get started, they live in that space for a long time, and then they have to transition. And that transition is really hard, right? Getting out of that operational space into a more strategically minded space. Shelley Kerchuk, our friend Shelley, here has a question for you, Bob. Thank you for the great presentation. She says, I need to consider taking a governance class. Give me a shout, Shelley. Shelley, we can sign you up. So she asked, in a member-driven organization, what are the distinguishing features between the board responsibilities and that of the CEO? Okay, so this is a bit of the same kind of angling in the same direction. How do you think about that question, Bob?
Yeah, I mean, the CEO is the one who, like I said, is doing the work to shape the strategy. They're running the operations. They're managing. Well, they don't manage the day-to-day. They, at a very high level, they manage the day-to-day. The board, they're the ones that provide that sounding board, that oversight, and critique and direction when necessary. The board has to stay at a very high level. CEO, and really as you move down in a corporate structure, you get more and more into the weeds and into the details. And as you move up in the corporate structure, you have to, I guess, have a broader perspective or broader vision. And so, I think that's kind of the key or the distinguishing feature. But the CEO, like they're right at the top, right? So they've got to have both their hands into the operations where it's necessary, but also maintain the strategic vision. And the board is that sounding board, and ultimately the ones who will approve final decisions and final direction, and course correct if they really do believe something's going in the wrong direction or they disagree with the CEO. So
yeah, no, and that happens.
it
That can
does.
happen.
That's
And
right.
and of course, the board has that critical role of hiring the CEO if the CEO is retiring or getting fired or whatever, right?
Great.
And
But
sometimes in that transition can be a little messy for the
great. If
board.
the board really disagrees with the CEO or doesn't trust the CEO, that's when they gotta, get a new CEO.
Right.
So
Right. Our friend John here, John Stevenson asks, how do you ensure, this is a great question, how do you ensure the board of directors continues to be a governance board when the board is now, if you've done this kind of outside person or you've appointed
yeah.
these experts, how do you assure they don't take on the responsibilities of management, like get into the weeds when they're supposed to be, because they're experts, right? So
Great.
their propensity might be to step in there and say, you're doing this wrong. Yeah, how do you manage that balance, Bob?
Well, and I will say I don't think stepping into the responsibilities of management is limited to experts, because a lot of us, so myself included, like I sit on the board of the Calgary Curling Club, and when you see something you don't like, you have a tendency to want to get involved,
Right.
get into the operations, but you do have to, as a board member, ensure that you stay back, right, and you let management run with things. I think a lot of people, struggle with that line, regardless of whether they're an expert or, or
Right.
not. So I think I really answer it more generally or more broadly, to say that, you have to, one, I think, conduct training. I think that's important. Governance training is critical. I know a lot of other cooperatives in my discussions with them, struggle with this very issue, and it is really heavily focused on training and onboarding and reminding, directors in large organizations like UFA, reminding them of their roles, and clearly setting out, sort of the role of the director versus the role of management. Um, and then I think it's constant training and constant reminding. So, and I will say that, at the end of the day, if you think about it logically, a board member, say of UFA, to try to get involved in operations in the day to day, it's just too much, right? Even for a CEO, they have to stay at such a high level. They can only get involved here and there. So, it is a struggle for people, but I think training and constant reminding is kind of the way you deal with that. So
Great, thanks, Bob. John, I see you've put your camera on. Did you have a follow-up? You don't have to. I just saw you come online here.
Um, no, I really loved Bob's answer that it's that constant process and checking in, and the board self-governing as well, because there may be times when that instance happens, and that's why we have in-camera session and board meetings to say, did we start to step into an area in a way that we may be phenomenally interested, but are we stepping in a governance manner rather than as a directing management manner? So I think you'd probably agree, Bob, that it's a voyage, not a destination, right?
Exactly. I mean, it happens,
Yep.
right? It's human nature, I think, to when you see an issue, to almost want to dive in and correct it. But I really like your point too about the self-governing piece of this. I will say that I've been quite impressed with the UFA board over my time, in doing exactly that, where if somebody sort of steps over the line, they do talk amongst themselves and course correct. Because it does happen from time to time. It's just, again, it's just human nature, right? So
Right.
And because we care about the cooperatives that we're
absolutely.
Yeah. Yeah.
And there's more passion, right? I think that's the, if I could go back to
Yeah. Go
the
ahead.
earlier question, but that's one thing I do see more in the cooperative sector is there's so much more passion, for the co-op than say in a public company setting.
Yeah.
Not that there's no passion, but this is personal ownership for a lot of people, right? So
Right. Yeah. For sure.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, John. So just I have a couple of comments and a question. Lean, the person who is from Latvia, just says this is a nice thank you to you, Bob. This has been a great boost to my future research and analysis. He or she, I'm sorry, I don't know if your gender, have even started writing a doctoral thesis on these questions. So just a thank you to you, Bob. And there's a question from Chloe here. How are boards investing in accessible education? For example, shared platforms, recruitment, upskilling and onboarding, co-working spaces, digital nomad strategies. Not sure. Let's, if you have any reflections on those questions, maybe around the investing in accessible education for the delegates, for the members, for themselves.
yeah, I think I would actually even point to the center for some of this, right?
Right.
A large number of the cooperative sector fund the Canadian Centre that puts on a number of different governance courses in general for everyone.
Right.
And quite often, Marc-André, they're either free or a really reasonable price.
Right.
Even that dashboard that and the database that's been created, that's a cooperative effort. We've all voluntarily put our information in there for the betterment of the entire sector. So I think those are a few examples of how, we share resources, we share training. I know I've personally shared some of UFA's training with another cooperative that has asked for it, and they've done the same back. And it's that spirit of cooperation. So it's not just even investing in, it's actually happening between cooperatives. Again, it's the beauty of the cooperative sector.
Yeah, I'll just amplify a little bit of what you were saying, Bob. That the database is informed by a survey, and that survey is quite painful. I'm not gonna lie, right? Bob knows. It's takes some hours. And we get, we had over 100 respondents in our last wave, and we hope to do better this time. So people are willing to share. And then the courses that Bob referred to is we've often, in those cases, co-developed those with co-ops first. And increasingly they're run out of co-ops first. But we are kind of stewards and assistant with that process and helped incubate a lot of that work. So if you want to check out those free courses Bob was alluding to, that's the place to go. Is there any follow-up questions here? I have one, Bob. You mentioned your delegates and their geographic expansiveness of the regions, right? The delegate areas. What are the expectations of your delegates in terms of, like, it sounds like they think they have to go out and visit people, and do they? And what does that look like?
So yeah, they do. So we have, and this is them taking this on themselves.
Right.
They have, the delegate body has a delegate representation committee that oversees their body, and they self-police this. They have what they call a delegate accountabilities chart, and on that chart is visiting sites and talking to members and a number of other different things that, as a delegate, we call them sort of the minimum expectations of a delegate, and they have their checklist of things that they're supposed to do, and a lot of them go well above and beyond what's on the chart. But it's self-policing, I guess, at the end of the day, and they do a good job of it.
Very cool. Very cool. And I imagine this all factors into the delegate compensation too, right? Well, the kilometers and all those per diems and all that kind of stuff that we have in our database.
Well, and just on that, this last year we voted as an assembly to compensate delegates.
Right.
So you now get an annual retainer from us.
Right. Right.
And you know, it's something that we felt was important when you're holding people accountable. You know, we're asking them to do a lot in representing our members, and they should be fairly compensated for that. So.
You mentioned earlier in response to a question about the difference between a corporation, publicly traded, and a cooperative, and the members have maybe a little more passion and so those kinds of things, and they don't necessarily always get elected on a slate. And how much do you think your board members? I know I'm asking you to do some mind reading here. So how much do you think your board members are thinking about that political context, right? Like, that they might have to re-represent themselves for election next go, when their term's up. They have to make their decisions palatable to those delegates who are going to elect them and ultimately the members. How much is that playing in their head as they're, and balancing that against, like, using that word balance again, against those strategic kind of imperatives and thinking of the cooperative sector, the cooperative as a whole. Do you get the sense? Do you hear that kind of coming out? Is that how does that play?
You know what? I mean, there's always an element of politics, I would say, in an election process. But for the most part, I think our directors do what they believe is best for UFA, regardless of the consequences, right?
Okay.
And I think they do a really good job for the most part of explaining their decisions and why. And I know a large number of them reach out regularly and contact different parts of our delegate body and our membership to have regular discussions about what's going on, that they can share, because some of it's right?
Exactly. Yeah.
So,
yeah. I mean, I think I didn't mean that in any negative way. I think you have to have some, sense of how this is going to fly. I mean, your whole democratic review process kind of hinges on, can we sell this? Like, is this available?
well,
yeah.
It does, because ultimately the delegate body elects them, right? So everybody's got to be sort of rowing in that same direction,
right.
For the cooperative to move forward. So, there's an element of selling what we're wanting to do, and there's an element of listening to, what the delegates who represent the membership, want to see.
Right. That's a great question here, Bob, from Gord. Is there any pressure? Do you ever see any pressure from membership to explore opportunities outside of UFA's core services, and in particular in rural communities when they lose services and amenities, and maybe they don't have the card lock anymore or whatever, right? Like, what do you get that kind of percolating up ever in the conversations?
I think occasionally. So it's kind of I've answered the question in almost two parts. Stuff outside of what is core to us, I don't think we get a lot of commentary around, trying to expand the services among past our core offering. Okay. I think we have a tendency to want to do that. Like I'll take our livestock business, for instance, right? You want to add, say, additional functionality to our feeding machines, or you want to bring in a new technology or something like that. So we're constantly trying to bring new offerings. Usually it's still within our core service areas. So I don't think we see a lot of pressure to do something completely, outside of our core services. I will say, though, that we constantly hear about farm and ranch stores in Saskatchewan, and when we're going to open one of those up, because we've opened up a number of petroleum locations so far. So interesting. We do get some pressure from, or at least on that side anyway. We're definitely
members. Yeah. Well, we're nearing the end. I don't see any more questions in chat. I have one more, Bob, just because I don't know if people know this, but I remember you shared the story with me a few years ago. I think it was Brian Jean shared a copy of his invoice from he was at a UFA. I don't know if it was a card lock or whatever, but he had a really good price on his gasoline, right? And then he tweeted that, or some social media, and then
it was a tweet. It was still a tweet back then.
It was before X, yes. Yep. And then there was a kind of influx of members, right? Or customers. I'm not sure which.
Yes.
But can you talk a bit about that from a governance perspective, like how you manage those, almost like tourist members, who come in, want that good price, and then if you're not the cheapest deal out, they kind of leave, and how does that play out in your governance? Have you thought about that? What that means for governance?
Well, so we were appreciative of the tweet, first off. Right. It was something along the lines of, thanks to UFA for, pricing appropriately in the market, or something along those lines. It drove literally, I think we signed up 60 to 80,000 new accounts in a very short period of time, or at least we had to issue 60 to 80,000 of new petroleum cards out to a number of different accounts. I think the number of accounts was actually lesser than that, but it was such a huge demand at the time that our card manufacturer, card provider ran out of cards. So we couldn't keep up. So we appreciated the business. We did hear about it from members who were saying your lines are way too long.
Right.
The impetus behind it is we're a wholesaler of fuel. We keep our pricing consistent, and sometimes our pricing disassociates from the retail market, either positive or negatively. And in this case, the discount on our fuel was much lower priced than the rest of the market. So, but we maintain our price, and if you buy from us over a period of time, you should do better than if you're buying at retail stations. Right. So anyway, there was a big disconnect, huge amount of demand for our cards, and then huge amount of lines at our petroleum stations. And we were appreciative of the business. We did hear about it, from our core membership. But ultimately, when it comes down to it, our core membership is what matters. We try to keep them happy, and we try to manage the rest of the business accordingly. And so we welcomed the business, and we recognize that it was at times challenging for some of our core membership. And if people are going to chase the best pricing, they're going to chase the best pricing. But we're not changing our pricing as a result of that. Right.
Yeah, that's I think it's I love that story, because I think it's such an interesting example of where the cooperative mindset, being focused on those core members, it makes a difference, right? Like because the risk is, in that scenario, you start chasing those people,
right,
and you shed these core members who've stuck by you for a long time and understand you, right? And so the whole pursuit of growth can often get in this murky space where you're chasing new people and forgetting about your core, and I think that's a difficult balancing act that cooperatives have to manage.
Yeah, I'll put another shout out to our elected officials, because they keep us focused on our core membership. So,
that's fantastic.
Again, power of the core.
Okay, Bob. Well, look, we're at time. Thank you so much. This is wonderful. You've got a lot of nice kudos in the chat, and we'll share that with you later. This video recording, this conversation will be shared with anyone who registered for the discussion. And thank you all for joining us. I'm going to just do a little plug here for our next co-op conversation. That's going to be taking place on March 5th, and our speaker will be Tom Ivey, the Community Development Manager at Cooperation. Now, you may have noticed that countless cooperatives have .coop on their website address instead of .com or .ca, and Cooperation is the organization that manages all those domains. And Tom's going to give us an introduction to the scale and scope of the online presence of the global cooperative sector. He'll dive into the Cooperative World Map, an exciting new initiative launched in Delhi from I think the ICA conference there in November. And we're going to do this in part to celebrate the International Year of the Cooperative, which is 2025. So registration will be coming on that very soon, and we hope to see you there. And I think that's it. Thank you again for being with us today. We'll see you soon, I hope.